I'm Annie from MumLife Australia, and you're listening to the MumLife Australia podcast, where we combine evidence-based information with practical tips to empower, inspire, and support mums. Today's episode of the podcast is all about what mums can really expect from the first 48 hours of their parenting journey. This episode shifts the focus away from childbirth and instead focuses on that transition to motherhood and actually caring for a newborn. It's all about empowering women so they know what to expect from the moment their child enters the world. Our expert guest is MumLife Australia's birth and babies expert, Hayley Patsalou. As a midwife and MAMABirth educator, Hayley has supported thousands of women in their transition to motherhood. In this episode, we talk specifically about skin-to-skin contact immediately following birth, the timing of cord clamping, injections and vaccines at birth, a baby's second night, yes, that's actually a thing, common challenges faced by new breastfeeding mums, and the importance of well-informed support networks. What I love so much about today's episode is that it covers all the things I wish I knew but no one told me before I had my first child. Hi Hayley, welcome to the MumLife Australia podcast. It's an absolute delight to be chatting with you today. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Thanks, Annie.
My pleasure. Look, Hayley, I'm really excited to have you on and to be talking about all things babies and birth. But before we do that, Hayley, I explained in the intro that you're a midwife and that you run MAMABirth classes. I would love for you to tell us a little bit more about what you do as a midwife and a childbirth educator.
So as a midwife, I'm working in a hospital at the moment as a caseload midwife. So I have a small group of women that I look after anywhere from, about 14, 16 weeks right through to 2 weeks after they have their babies. And alongside that work, I also work with Midwives and Mothers Australia and run their childbirth ed classes. So we wrote MumABirth as a way of being able to provide independent information for families, because a lot of the options available are more, I suppose, hospital orientated, or they might be under particular brands that might have very particular philosophies. So we just wanted to create something that was a little bit more, I guess, geared at mothers who were wanting broad evidence-based information and nothing that's selling them either a policy or, selling them a particular philosophy.
I love that. As you know, as our babies and birth expert, Hayley, MumLife Australia is all about providing evidence-based information to help mums make informed parenting decisions. And it really sounds like that is also the philosophy that you go by. So we love that. So Hayley, when we started to discuss this podcast episode, you said to me that you could spend 10 hours talking about the first 48 hours after a mum or a woman gives birth to a child. So unfortunately, we only have about 45 minutes, but I am going to pick your brains because I want to hear all of the things that you have gathered in your experience and the sorts of things that often women who are becoming mums, particularly first-time mums, may not have actually heard about or realised. And let's just fill them in so that they're prepared. So, Hayley, can we start at the beginning? And if we say that the beginning, for the purposes of this episode of the podcast, is the moment that baby, that tiny little newborn enters the world, what might a new mother expect to happen in those first, say, 2 to 3 hours where they're probably feeling, emotions of joy, relief? Hopefully both mother and child are doing well. So there's that relief of knowing that your baby is safe and that you're well. What can mums expect in those first couple of hours after they've given birth to their child?
So there's a lot of variation in terms of, perhaps where mum's given birth. Has she given birth at home? Has she given birth in the hospital? What type of birth has she had? Have there been medications on board? All that sort of thing. So I guess for the purposes of this, I'm just going to talk about, the biological norm, I suppose.
Fabulous.
Assuming that we've had, an unmedicated labour, baby's born at term and, has been born vaginally. So, baby comes out, standard practice is that the baby is, placed on mum's chest, or perhaps mum lifts the baby up. So maybe she's in water or, on the bed or on the floor or wherever she is. And so she brings her baby up to her, and that baby really will stay with that mother for several hours, in the ideal circumstances. So let's assume that baby comes out and they're lusty and they're crying and they're pink. They've got good muscle tone. So, they're sort of ticking off all those boxes of what we call an APGAR score. So that's looking at, whether the baby may require resuscitation, which the vast majority of babies don't. So, if that's the situation, there's no need to separate mum or baby. And so they stay together. And there's a lot of benefits to that. So when we're looking at the benefits for mum, Mother Nature really wants to protect mum in those first couple of hours, because the big risk for mums is bleeding after birth.
Sure. So
if we're keeping mum and baby together, mum's looking down at her baby, falling in love with her baby. She gets that massive rush of oxytocin, the hormone of love, which has helped her have effective contractions in labour, and also has effective contractions afterwards to help to shear that placenta away and control any bleeding. So, of course, feeling in love with her baby is definitely going to help that, and, promotes a lot of safety in that third stage of labour when we're birthing the placenta. And then if we think about the baby, some of the benefits to the baby of staying with mum would be that it helps to regulate their breathing and their heart rate and their temperature as well. So all of the things that the baby has got to do for itself for the first time now that it's actually come out, mum can help them do that.
And I know, having experienced this myself, they talk a lot about skin to skin. Is that part of all of this, that if possible, having baby skin directly on mum's skin?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely become a mainstay of practice now. I know, probably when we were born, babies were taken away to be cleaned up and wrapped up and then brought over to the mother. But we know now, and we're going back to that biological norm of that baby being placed bare against the mother's skin. And again, so many benefits to that. One of the interesting things that I found was that in flicking through the research, that they believe that the baby's amniotic fluid, the baby spreading the amniotic fluid over the mother is a way for the baby to perhaps find the breast afterwards.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a lot of different theories and a lot of research that's going on into why are these practices beneficial. And yeah, it's going back to that biological norm, really. The mother keeping the baby close for safety, but that also being safe for the mother.
Yeah. I've heard anecdotally that now they regard skin to skin to be so important that even if a mother has had a cesarean, they'll still try and get the skin to skin contact while everything else is going on. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hayley. They also say that if for some reason or another they're not able to have that skin to skin contact with mum, that they'll encourage dad to have that skin to skin contact. Is that something that you see in circumstances where perhaps mum is not able to have that skin to skin experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So as midwives, we really push for both of those things. So we really push for skin to skin in a theatre situation with mum as soon as possible, and particularly if mum's not able to, perhaps she's had a general anaesthetic or she's unwell, then definitely dad or whoever else is in there with mum. And the other thing I wanted to say as well is there was a study that was published fairly recently that looked at with cesareans breastfeeding rates afterwards. Yep. And they actually found that the sooner the baby had skin-to-skin contact with the mother, the more likely they were to successfully breastfeed.
Oh, wow. Isn't that interesting? It's such a primal experience having babies, because it's funny, as you started talking about biological norms and things like that, it really is primal. Like, unless you're giving birth at home, if you're in a hospital environment, we think of it as being a very medical experience. But when you flesh it back and take away all of that other stuff, it is, at the end of the day, the most primal experience we have as human beings, which is really quite interesting. Now, Hayley, the other thing I wanted to explore with you, and this is something that's come up a lot in popular media and it's becoming a lot more mainstream and well known, is this thing of cord clamping, and what I've heard a lot about, which is that delayed cord clamping. Can you explain to us what delayed cord clamping is and what might be the benefits and the risks of having the umbilical cord delayed clamping the delayed clamping of the umbilical cord?
Yeah, so to give a bit of background, I suppose, obviously the umbilical cord delivers nutrients to the baby from the placenta. So then once the baby's born, the baby's going to be taking their first breath, and that's when you actually switch over from fetal circulation into newborn circulation. So there's a couple of changes that happen inside the baby, and the old thinking was that it was best to clamp the cord as soon as the baby comes out, and you cut it straight away. The research that's been done has shown that if you leave the umbilical cord unclamped for at least 60 seconds, and in practice we do it for much longer than that, but the World Health Organization says at least 60 seconds, that it means that all the blood that's sitting in that placenta that's part of that fetal circulation will actually be transferred to the baby outside. So we're increasing the baby's iron stores, we're increasing the levels of stem cells that they have, and it's also delivering oxygen. So if we have a baby that's potentially a little bit less vigorous than we would like, then that extra connection, I suppose, that extra lifeline may be really helpful for getting everything kicking for them. Right.
And so if a mother prior to having given birth, or even at that point at which the cord is clamped, doesn't make the decision or doesn't express a desire to have a delayed clamping of the cord, is there general practice as to what would happen, or does it really depend on whoever is delivering the baby or where you're delivering the baby, or is there an actual practice as to what might happen if you don't make that choice?
Like you said, there is a bit of variation depending on who's looking after the mum and also the place of birth. And the other factor would be how the third stage of labour is being managed. So if we're intervening or if we're letting it happen naturally, and we could have another podcast about that.
Sure.
But essentially, for most midwives, it's definitely standard practice to leave the umbilical cord. It's very, very widely known, and there may be some old school midwives out there that might not sort of do it just as part of their normal practice. And most doctors are aware of it too, but sometimes we do sort of have to just remind them, just leave the cord for a bit.
Sure, I understand. Okay, great. Okay, so next I want to then talk about, so you've given birth to the baby, you've had the cord clamped, you've had that skin to skin, so the baby's sitting nicely on your chest, and then we obviously then perhaps might have to give the baby then to a midwife to have it weighed and anything else that might happen at that point. Now, from my experiences, the thing that stands out in my mind at that end of the process is the issue of having the baby vaccinated with a couple of different vaccinations. I'm not sure if that's the right terminology, so feel free to correct me in a second, but the vitamin K and the Hep B stands out in my mind. Now, it's interesting when we talk about the vitamin K because I've had 2 babies and I've given birth twice, and the first time I was asked whether I was happy for the midwife to go ahead and do that with both the vitamin K and the Hep B. Obviously, I had a pretty good idea what the Hep B was about, but I had no idea what the vitamin K was for. And having no idea, I said to the midwife, who I knew quite well, she was a caseload midwife, so I had her throughout my entire pregnancy and also my birth. And I basically just said to her, look, I'm not sure, you do what's best, what you think is best for the baby. Interestingly, I then went on to have a second baby, and I still don't know what the vitamin K was for. So can you fill us in on what those 2 injections are all about, and what purpose they serve, and perhaps anything else that we need to consider before giving consent for that?
Yeah, so I guess for a timeline sake of things, let's say baby's been on mum's chest, it's had its first breastfeed, because we just leave them together for that, and it may be perhaps an hour, it might be 2 hours, it may be even more than that before we consider weighing, measuring, and doing the injections. But yeah, to talk about vitamin K and Hep B, the vitamin K came into it because they realised that babies have low levels of vitamin K naturally. Vitamin K is involved in clotting, essentially. So adults, we produce it in our guts, whereas babies have been found to have low levels of that. So as a result, they can develop something called vitamin K deficiency bleeding, and it's an extremely rare condition, about 1 in 100,000 or something minuscule like that. So it sort of has become standard practice around the world to offer this vitamin K injection around the time of birth, because what the research has shown is that any baby that receives the vitamin K injection, it's pretty much 100% insurance policy that they will not develop the vitamin K deficiency bleeding.
Right.
So I guess where the argy-bargy is in medical circles is why would babies be born with born without something that they desperately need? So there's kind of a bit of wondering why nature might have left that out of the blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
Is it perhaps actually quite advantageous for babies to not have high levels of vitamin K? So there's a lot of questions about it. In terms of the risks, other than the discomfort to the baby of having the injection, the research doesn't show that there's any untoward side effects or potential short or long-term risks for the baby. And giving the vitamin K may be particularly important in situations where the baby may be at higher risk of bleeding. So let's say maybe a forceps birth or a vacuum birth or a cesarean, something where the baby's maybe being pulled or twisted or tugged, and certainly if there's any bleeding disorders in the family.
Right, I understand. Okay, great. And the Hep B?
So Hep B is a vaccination. So they sort of brought this in because of the large numbers of migrants from Southeast Asian countries where Hep B is quite prevalent. So they sort of brought this in as like a public health initiative. Every baby gets their first Hep B vaccination at birth. Essentially, it's an extra vaccination. So it's on top of whatever the normal schedule of vaccines is for the baby.
Right.
And so I guess the question for parents as to whether or not they want to do the Hep B vaccine, a couple of things to think about would be, first of all, is this baby at a high risk of contracting Hep B? So a mum and dad, perhaps from Southeast Asian countries where there is a high prevalence of Hep B, mum and dad perhaps IV drug users or, sex workers or in some sort of high-risk profession perhaps, and then also thinking about the environment that the baby's in. So some people would argue that being in a hospital is a high-risk environment because there's needles around, there's lots of different people. So Hep B can be contracted only via blood exposure and bodily fluids as well. So if the baby's not coming into contact with those in the home environment, perhaps the family might think, okay, we're not going to do the Hep B because it is an extra vaccine. They're not missing out on anything by not having it at birth. Like, it's not going to mean that they're not immune to it down the track.
Okay, I understand. Interesting. Because like I said, in my experience, which is just one experience, I don't particularly remember receiving a lot of information about it. And like I said, I really just put the onus on my midwife to make the decision that she thought was best for my child at that point. I clearly at that point in time had other things to think about, so I was happy for her to make that decision. But it's really, it's good to be informed about these things and just know what the purposes of them are.
Yeah, it's pretty much just a public health thing really with the Hep B. Yeah, and most hospitals will get mums to sign consent forms to consent to both Hep B and vitamin K, and there's no real resistance, I suppose, if mums do make an informed decision not to have either.
Okay. Fabulous. Okay, now you mentioned before we started talking about the vitamin K and the Hep B, you mentioned that in the optimal timeline, we're talking about the ideal situation here, knowing full well that, of course, it doesn't always work out this way, but we obviously need to use something as our baseline for discussion. You mentioned the baby's first breastfeed, and I really want to take some time in this particular podcast episode to speak about the first breastfeed and that breastfeeding journey. And we could talk about it, for the first, 3 months, 6 months, whatever the case might be. But I want to focus specifically on the first breastfeed and then perhaps what mums can expect in the first 48 hours after giving birth to their baby, in terms of feeding their baby, I mean. And something I didn't realise, and you can elaborate on this in a moment, Hayley, is that there seems to be a movement towards encouraging mums to express colostrum. So we know that colostrum is what your breasts produce prior to producing the breast milk as such. But, there's this movement towards encouraging mums to express colostrum. So can you talk us about what happens in terms of breastfeeding in those perhaps the first breastfeed, and then moving on to the first 48 hours, and what might be some things that surprise mums, what they can do to prepare, and what they might be able to do to make it what is a difficult process. Breastfeeding is not easy. What they might be able to do to make that an easier transition.
Yeah, sure. So I'll come back to the antenatal colostrum expressing. The baby's first breastfeed normally would sort of happen in that first hour or so after birth. When babies come out, they're very, very alert and looking around, and that's why we do like to keep the lights really quite low in the birth room, especially in the first couple of hours, so that the baby, they're opening their eyes and they're looking around. It's sort of that womb-like environment almost for them. And of course, this could be affected by the mode of birth, and it could also be affected by medication. Some babies are less alert because of narcotic medication or Epidurals as well have been shown to reduce the alertness of babies. But let's say this baby comes out, they're very, very alert, they're looking around. We sort of tend to recommend that you place the baby near the breast rather than shaping the breast or shaping the nipple, and putting the baby on, because they sort of don't learn anything that way. They don't imprint those pathways in their brain as to what they're supposed to do.
And Hayley, it's interesting that you say that, because there was only a 2-year gap between my first and my second. First, my baby was placed on my breast. I was shown exactly how to feed, and it was all done for the baby. But my second was slightly different. That wasn't the case, and I'll let you continue. But it's interesting because there definitely seems to be a change in what's happening in this experience of the first breastfeed. So I'll let you continue.
So there's some really good YouTube videos that you can watch of something called the breast crawl. And Annie, you might have experienced this with your second baby.
I did.
But yeah, essentially when you put the baby near the nipple, the baby does actually know what they're doing, and they have those instincts to try and find the nipple and to get on and attach.
It's actually quite amazing.
It's incredible. It absolutely blew my mind the first time I saw it. But yeah, they, for those who may not have seen this, what the baby does is they sort of bob their head around. They use their arms to move. They sort of press up from the mum a little bit as well. And, having that areola, that darker part of the nipple that does become darker in pregnancy, they believe that that's like a way of, almost a target for the baby, so they can see that and they head towards that. So the baby then might get to the nipple and they might just sort of play around with it a little bit. It might come in and out of their mouth. They might get a bit cranky, and then what they tend to do is they tend to open their mouth really widely and then get onto it there and start doing a few shallow little sucks, and then progressing on to potentially longer sucks that are a little bit stronger. And we just let them do what they do in this time. If we've got no other risk factors that we're thinking of that this baby really needs to get a good feed, like, diabetes or, maybe that they're a very, very small baby, etc., then we just let them do what they do. They're imprinting, they're learning, they're developing those instincts. And the research shows that when the babies are left to do that, they actually breastfeed much better in the first few days and indeed beyond.
Yeah, very interesting.
So I suppose that's the first breastfeed. Most babies will have quite a big feed at that time, and then they're normally pretty zonked for the first day. So they sort of come out, they're really excited, they get on, they have a feed, and then they fall asleep. And mum and dad, normally are quite exhausted in this time as well. So it's really, really important that if your baby has fallen asleep, get some sleep.
Yes, instead of what most mums do, which is sit there and stare at the baby and think, oh my God, how did I do this? And what am I going to do now? Which I think
exactly right.
is what we most of us tend to do as soon as the baby's born. We think, oh geez, I can't believe this. I can't believe that little baby is born and here. But you're right. It is the first day is the best opportunity you're going to get as much sleep as you can.
That's it. And as well-meaning as relatives and visitors are, sometimes it's a really good idea actually not to tell them that you've had the baby. Get a few really good hours of sleep in that time if your baby's asleep, and then maybe call the relatives and visitors, and then you can decide whether you want to invite them, whether you're at home or in hospital. So that's just a little side tip there.
I think it's also, again, this is not necessarily specific to this issue of breastfeeding or even the first 48 hours, but I think also if you've had, and I've spoken to a lot of people, MumLife Australia has done a lot of work with people who have experienced traumatic birth experiences, or perhaps even just experiences that weren't traumatic but not exactly what the mother and father had intended from their birth experience. And perhaps that first day, taking that first day to really, or just the first couple of hours, to really just absorb what's happened and to mentally prepare yourself for what this new transition is going to be for you, and I guess come to terms with the birth experience. We go from pregnancy to being in labour to being a mother, and one of the steps that I think gets kind of sidelined with the excitement and of having this new baby is that we don't take that moment to consciously just say, wow, I just had a baby, and it may or may not have been exactly what I had planned, but I've just birthed this child and my body did what it needed to do, or perhaps it didn't do it exactly as I had intended for it to do, but I've just accomplished this birthing experience, and taking a moment to just basically be grateful for that, I guess.
That's right, and taking a moment to really be in the moment and to experience that with your partner or, your support person as well. I think it's really, really undervalued, and especially, with social media and everything being so well connected nowadays. But, So the first 48 hours, I've mentioned that the baby is normally very sleepy in that first day. They normally have at least one good breastfeed, and they may have a few more. It's not abnormal for a baby to sleep a bit longer. So, even 7-8 hours sometimes I've seen.
Sure.
If we've got a healthy term baby, there's no reason why we do need to be intervening. However, if we're concerned, then, because of the size or other medical issues, then that might be an indication for waking the baby and attaching them and, trying to get things going. Yeah, so if the baby's had that, fairly sleepy first day, it's very likely going to be a ravenous little piranha on the second day.
Oh, yes, and piranha is a really good descriptive term, I have to say.
Yes, so they tend to wake up on that second day and they want to feed the whole time and they want to cluster feed. And a lot of that has to do with the size of their stomach. They've got a stomach the size of a cherry roughly, so they do need to be fed frequently because of the small size. It has to do with how well colostrum is absorbed by the baby. So the fact that they absorb it so well, you have to keep putting it in because it's not just sitting in there and, keeping them full for a long time, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And then you've also got the factor of the baby switching over from the mother metabolizing everything for them and, running their functions to now the baby has to do it themselves. So it's quite a complex, I guess, biological process for the baby and psychologically for the baby as well. They've just spent 9 months having all of their needs met without them having to think about it to, now potentially sleeping in a plastic box, in a cot and, there's different sounds. It's not warm anymore. It's quite a I guess an insult to their senses and to their behaviours because they've now got to actually ask for things and they've got to do things for themselves.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so some really common things that I'll see will be what we call like the second night. So typically when you're working on a postnatal ward in particular, or maybe if you're, working in the community and you go and see a mum on that second night, everything's a bit of a mess because we've got a cluster feeding baby, so a baby that's feeding very, very frequently, not having long sleeps, just, wanting to constantly feed. And, perhaps there's been a lot of visitors throughout the day or, mum's been awake all day because of, whatever else is going on. And that second night is really, really tough.
It is, and you know what, Hayley, what concerns me about all of this, based on my experience, women are being encouraged, and rightly so. I know that there is a lot of really good evidence that getting women out of hospitals as soon as possible helps with recovery and all of that. However, in my experience, with both my children, I was only in hospital for just over 24 hours, so I didn't experience the second night with the support of anyone there other than my husband. And what was the clincher for me was I had no idea of this second night. I really had no idea. Of course, I knew what to expect in terms of the baby wanted to feed and I'd need to change the baby. I might need to burp the baby and all of that. But I had no idea that I would have to spend literally like 12 to 13 hours with a baby gnawing at my breasts for 12 to 13 hours of the second night. And I didn't have that because I didn't know about it. I actually had no idea and I freaked out. And my baby was...
Did you feel, Annie, like maybe you were doing something wrong, or did you feel like something wasn't right with you or with your baby?
Absolutely. And we kept taking her off the breast and she kept crying. And my husband kept saying, what's wrong with her? Like, as in, what's wrong? Like, is she okay? Is there something wrong with her? Should we be concerned? Should we call? We had the support of a midwife. We hadn't been technically discharged from our hospital. Our midwife was coming in to visit myself and my baby every couple of days up until, I think, sort of day 10. But at that point in time, at 1 o'clock in the morning, she might as well have been in Mars because I didn't have her there at my beck and call to say, hey, relax, it's all right. So I'm really pleased that you're talking about this second night because I don't think it gets discussed often enough. And if we're going to encourage women to go home and have the recovery and that experience in their home environment, then we need to inform them of what to expect. Don't you think, Hayley?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think that really good quality antenatal education and support makes a huge difference. So we know that having a known midwife caring for you throughout your pregnancy in a caseload model, the research shows that those women will successfully breastfeed at higher rates, I suppose, than women who receive standard care.
Sure.
So that's why I am a really big advocate for, evidence-based education because I see in my practice what a huge difference it makes for mothers feeling informed, feeling in control. She doesn't feel like she's doing something wrong because she understands that, hey, you know what, this is what a normal baby does. And these are the things that I've done to prepare for it.
Yeah. And, as women and just generally people, we might be around babies, we might be around children, but we don't get a really good insight into newborns as much as we think we do. We might think that we're prepared for having a baby, and we might be prepared for what a baby might hold, or a toddler or a kid, but you don't spend a lot of time around newborns, and in fact most of the time you spend around newborns, the newborn's probably asleep, so you actually have no idea that newborns cry a lot.
And I think mums and dads do a really good job of making everything look like it's normal and okay.
Which we need to change.
we provide, I think as a society we place a lot of value on a good baby, and that good baby is the baby that sleeps. Everyone wants to know, is your baby a good sleeper? Whereas, if we think back again to that biological norm, we would have been seeing our mothers and our sisters and our cousins and everyone, we would have all been living together. We would have been seeing them breastfeeding 24/7. We would have seen a newborn baby. We would have seen birth.
Yep, and instead what we see is Facebook photos and Instagram filters.
That's right, yeah. So how is a new mum supposed to really get a grasp of what's normal and what's abnormal when we're presenting an altered reality? And we do have this really warped view of what a normal baby does, unfortunately.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about this cluster feeding? Now, you spoke very briefly about what the purposes of cluster feeding is for and why it happens. In those first 48 hours, is there any point at which we might say, as professionals might a midwife intervene and say, look, this baby is just not getting enough nutrients. We need to perhaps supplement with formula, or we need to consider expressing or something like that. Is there any circumstances in that first 48 hours or any evidence to support in those first 48 hours the intervention with something other than breast milk at the breast?
So when we're talking about evidence-based here, for a medically well-term baby, no, there's no evidence for supplements in the first 48 hours at all. However, that being said, though, a lot of, it is quite standard practice, especially in private hospitals, to offer a supplement of formula because, the mother may want to sleep. So that's definitely not evidence-based, and it's definitely not supported by the World Health Organisation or by the Australian Breastfeeding Association as well. So I suppose, another thing to bear in mind is cluster feeding has an important role in building up the mother's milk supply. So milk supply works on a supply-demand basis. The more the baby feeds or the more milk that's removed, the more milk the mother makes. So by that baby cluster feeding, and particularly overnight between 1 a.m. and 5 a.m. when the prolactin levels are highest, that's actually setting the mother up for a good milk supply. So by supplementing, what we're doing is we're giving the baby something that the baby's not taking from the mother. So potentially we're not stimulating that supply to reach the levels that the baby will require.
I understand. I know my experience with my first, I had a lot of difficulty breastfeeding, and it started from literally the moment she was put on my breast. And like I said, with my first Delilah, she was placed directly on my breast. There was no crawl at that stage. She was just placed on my breast. I was shown how to feed her, and I was told that she was having a lot of difficulty latching and sucking. Actually, I don't know, perhaps she was latching, but maybe she wasn't sucking. I can't remember exactly. And the entire time I was in hospital, I was advised that she just had a little bit of too much mucus from the birth. And so I syringe fed her for the entire time I was in hospital, which, like I said, wasn't very long, 24-ish hours. I then went home and syringe fed her at home, probably until day, I'd say probably 7 or 8, when I reached my breaking point and thought, this is absurd, and I called in help in the way of the world's most amazing lactation consultant who, to this day, I am so grateful for her, and I recommend her to everybody I know, who really did help support my breastfeeding journey. But it didn't start off brilliant, and to be honest, it didn't last as long as I had perhaps initially thought it might. But with the support of a lactation consultant, it certainly lasted a lot longer than it would have had I not received that support. So what are some things that might not go to plan when it comes to breastfeeding?
So perhaps, an instrumental birth or a caesarean birth where the baby may be pulled and twisted and tugged and not very keen to get on the breast. Certain medications, I've already mentioned that. But also some babies just don't quite get the hang of it, and we don't really know why. Sometimes there's variations in nipple shapes that might cause some issues. There's some variations in musculature and jaw in the baby, and also tongue ties can affect things. So it's, there are some things that can cause some issues, but the help of a really qualified and experienced lactation consultant, a lot of things can be solved quite easily. And syringe feeding is a really great alternative in the first couple of days, even if you need to supplement or if the baby's not latching at the breast. And the reason why syringe feeding actually came in was because they found that if you were wanting to breastfeed but giving the baby a dummy or a teat like on a bottle, they were actually finding that the baby then was refusing the breast because what they call nipple confusion, essentially, because the motion used to suck on a teat or a dummy is quite different to on the breast. So that's sort of why the syringe feeding came in.
So you're still able to give them the nutrition from the breast without actually physically providing them something other than the breast, I guess, a bottle or a teat, a manufactured breast, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. So problems like that are, they're fairly common in the medicalised world of giving birth, and even for women that don't have that experience, sometimes things just don't go to plan, and sometimes it's not very helpful to look for reasons why, because sometimes that can make things more stressful. So that's where I would recommend that if you feel like something's not working, that you ask for help sooner rather than later.
Absolutely.
And asking for help from a lactation consultant. So if you've given birth in a public hospital, there will be definitely lactation consultants around that you can ask for a referral to. Private hospitals are a lot harder because they don't tend to have the same regulations around promoting breastfeeding. And if you're out in the community, then you can, or anyone really can, see a private lactation consultant, and we can upload some information for how to find one as well.
Yep, that's great. So I think it's commonly accepted now by most people that, and maybe it's not, who knows, that breastfeeding is difficult, isn't it, Hayley? Like, it's not something that it's difficult. It's natural, but it can be hard. And I really want to set that expectation for mums or mums to be, is that it is the most amazing thing to be able to feed your child at breast. But I also want to set the expectation that it's something that is learnt as well. Your baby needs to create that learning experience, which you spoke about initially, about why we now encourage them to crawl to the breast. That's a learning experience for them. And there's a huge learning curve for us as mums too. It's natural and it might be primal, but there is also that element of we just need to be mindful that it's not necessarily something that, here's the baby, here's your boob, you pop them on and there you go forever. You can breastfeed until you decide you don't want to. It's not necessarily always like that.
It's very rarely like that.
It is. That's right.
And I've got a few friends who are midwives, and I've got a friend who's a midwife and a lactation consultant, and both of them had very, very challenging experiences breastfeeding. And it wasn't that they had problems per se; they were just normal challenges.
Yeah.
But it's challenging. There's there's nothing to take away from the normal challenges of breastfeeding. Even when things are going well, it's still hard.
So let's make this practical, and let's say if you're a mum listening, if you're a mum to be listening to this, or perhaps you're a mum and this is your second experience giving birth to a baby, and what practical advice have you got, Hayley, as a midwife, but also as a MAMABirth educator? What practical advice have you got that mums could take on board prior to having the baby, and perhaps something after the baby that might be able to assist them in successfully breastfeeding, if that's what they want to do?
So the first thing that I would say would be really good quality education. So a big part of what we do in MumABirth, one of our sessions is on breastfeeding, and we go through everything. We go through biology of it. We go through what does the baby have to do to breastfeed. We show videos of ultrasounds of the baby sucking on the nipple so that the mums have a really good idea of how far into the mouth the baby has to take the nipple. Like, we just cover such a broad topic of what's normal, and then also problems and how to solve some of those problems.
Which is significantly more than most antenatal classes would cover.
Absolutely, yeah. I know I'm a little bit biased, but we do spend a lot of time on it. And another source of really good quality education would be the Australian Breastfeeding Association. So they do run classes all around Australia, and there's also mothers groups all around Australia that you can join to go and meet other breastfeeding mothers or other mothers who are wanting to breastfeed. And then there's also some really good videos out there on the Raising Children Network. They've got some great videos on attachment and positioning that, if you're pregnant, that would be a really good resource for you to tap into. Okay.
You mentioned colostrum and expressing colostrum. Where does that fit in all of this? Is that something that helps us with this process of transitioning to a breastfeeding mum?
Yeah, so look, expressing colostrum is quite a contentious issue. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to support it, but the research is being done to see whether this is a beneficial process or not. I have to say I do include it in my practice, even though it's not strictly evidence-based, because I see the difference that it makes for the mums that I look after.
So what is it? Sorry, Hayley, can you just explain what expressing colostrum... So we're talking about expressing colostrum before the baby's born, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so normally from about 37 weeks of pregnancy, we would show a mother how to express, so using her hands to, express small amounts of colostrum, and we're talking really small amounts here. Most mums don't have much at all. Storing it in a syringe, popping it in the freezer.
Oh, okay. I thought that you were just going to say that it's the process of building up the supply of colostrum. So are we using it then?
So you can use it. One of the reasons why we would recommend expressing antenatally would be perhaps if you're having a planned cesarean, because we know that sometimes those babies don't breastfeed as well, or if we know that you've got a medical condition where the baby's likely to need supplements, so perhaps diabetes, thyroid conditions, if we know that you've got a growth-restricted baby, etc. So having that supply on hand may be really helpful in those first few days. And we think that it may help building up supply, but that's the thing that's really not conclusively shown in the research.
Okay.
So the reason why I recommend antenatal colostrum expressing is more for the confidence for the mother, not getting to know how her breast works, getting to know that she actually does have some milk there, and it also does help to release that oxytocin hormone to potentially help with getting into labour and intensifying those contractions if you are in labour too. So that's why we say don't do it before 37 weeks.
I have heard that actually. I know that this podcast episode's not specifically about the birth of the baby, but I have heard that stimulation of the breast is one of the methods. Now, whether it's evidence-based, I don't know, but it's one of the methods of perhaps bringing on labour. It
probably doesn't bring on labour, because if it did, we wouldn't have medical inductions.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you're probably right.
Because it releases the sucking at the breast releases oxytocin, which is part of that process of the baby getting the milk. But yeah, if we're wanting to be in labour, we need to be in an oxytocin dominant state. So there's no reason why it wouldn't help.
Wow, I am just floored by all of that information. I think it's so useful that we really do allow pregnant women and mums, and you know what? Dads to be as well, to be informed about this, because it really does put you into a much stronger position of power once that baby is born, so that you're not in the position that perhaps I was when I brought my 24-ish hour baby home and I thought, holy moly, I don't know what's wrong with this baby and maybe we need to call somebody because I am so overwhelmed and I'm so scared and I've got no idea. So this sort of information really does help prepare mums and dads to transition from being a pregnant to actually having a newborn in your arms.
That's right, and it does also help if you're able to then take that information and share it with your family and friends, so that if you are a pregnant mum or if you're a dad to be, that you're sharing this information with your family and friends that are going to be around you, so that you've got a really well informed support network as well, so that when that baby comes, we're all on the same page, we're all working together, and we're taking care of each other.
That's exactly right, and it goes back to what we said earlier about this new digital age of pruned photos that look perfect and filters. If we take it upon ourselves to support one another, to be honest and real and unmask ourselves, which MumLife Australia is a lot about, if we do that, then we get rid of this perception that it's easy and that you just give birth to a baby and you become a mum and that's it, and then everything after that is just so easy. If we talk about it and we're honest and we're realistic, we are able to create support networks for each other rather than sitting at home alone, isolated, scared, wondering where to go for help because you're too scared to tell anyone that you're struggling, basically.
Yep, that's absolutely right.
Thank you so much, Hayley. I am so appreciative of your time. And Hayley, I'm really proud to announce that you are our birth and babies expert, and we are so thrilled to have you in the MumLife Australia community. So for those listening at home, if you have a question about anything we've discussed on this episode of the podcast, or you have any question about birth and babies, well, Hayley is the woman to go to, and you can contact her through MumLife Australia. But Hayley, I'd love for you to tell our listeners, where can they find out more about what you do as a midwife and a MAMABirth educator? How can people get in touch with you, and how can they lean on you for support?
So the best place probably would be Facebook. So if you type into Facebook Midwives and Mothers Australia or MAMABirth, I should come up that way. Otherwise, you can always send me an inquiry through our website. So that's midwivesandmothers.com.au.
Fabulous. Look, what I'll do is, Hayley, I'm going to pop all of that information on the show notes for this particular podcast episode. So if you are interested, you can get in touch with Hayley. Thank you so much, Hayley. I really appreciate your time, and I really look forward to the content that you'll be providing to our audience through the MumLife Australia website.
Thanks, Annie.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the MumLife Australia podcast. You can find additional resources and links to all of the studies mentioned in today's podcast on the show notes at www.mumlifeaustralia.com. And don't forget to join the MumLife Australia community on Facebook. That's where you can have your questions answered by our tribe of experts and our podcast guests.